you clearly have made everyone know who you are and what you do. We have two other panelists here we're excited about. Maybe you guys could both introduce yourself as we start out. Jana.
I am Jana Remes, a partner at the McKinsey Global Institute based in San Francisco. Earned my stripes working with the tech companies in Silicon Valley, and for the last 10 plus years have been leading our global research looking at economic performance across cities and industries around the globe.
I'm Francesca Bria. I'm the Chief Technology and Digital Innovation Officer of Barcelona City Hall. So I'm the only Italian in a Catalan government, the only foreigner, and I was appointed by the Mayor of Barcelona my brief was very clear, was how can we rethink the smart city from the ground up with citizens. So I'm in charge of the digital and innovation policy of the city.
Okay, so first question, let's just sort of start out quite in a broad fashion. And maybe, Francesca, you could start with this. So, what is a smart city, and what's the purpose of making a city smart? Like, what are we really trying to do here? What are the key aims of the work that you do, for instance?
Yeah, I think for us it's very important to rethink the smart city from a perspective, from a non-technocratic perspective. So a lot of the work that I've been doing was how can we rethink the smart city as a very important political thing. And so how can we put citizen first? How can we understand that when we talk about smart city, it's about making the future of cities? And so this is about going back to what are the critical things, the critical policies that you're trying to solve in your city. So moving away from a technology push agenda, like a vendor push agenda, where you think you put a lot of technology in the city, sensor, connectivity, big data, and all of a sudden you are able to solve complex problems. But going back to what really citizens need and building the smart city together with citizens. So at the end is a question of giving an answer to the crisis of democracy. So for us, it's very clear that we understand that today political institution, financial institution has lost legitimacy, and we are in a crisis of the political institution and the financial institutions, and many people, in particular young people, feel disenfranchised, they feel left out. And so we need to give an answer to this disenfranchisement, and otherwise people don't trust institutions, they also don't trust corporations, in particular with the algorithmic big powers that control data and algorithms like black boxes. And so basically we need to bring people in and show that we have clear priorities. For instance, in Barcelona, some of the things we're trying to do is about affordable housing, is about energy transition. So we are creating a renewable energy operator to produce and distribute energy. It is about sustainable mobility, like we're increasing 3 kilometers of bike lanes, integrating public transportation in a way that is more accessible for people. It is about participatory democracy and leveraging digital technologies to create a real participatory democracy. I think for us this is the only answer to right-wing populism. Otherwise we're going to have a disenfranchisement of the population.
Okay, so you're seeing it through very much a kind of a political kind of lens. Jana, we've been talking about smart cities for quite a long time now. Are we delivering on the promise of smart cities, or is there still a big gap between possibility and execution at the moment?
Yeah, I think we are actually just at the brink of a new era of smart cities. I love the fact that you are asking the question of why do we have smart cities? Because we used to start thinking about it all about technology, exactly as you said, Francesca. Yet that really didn't pay out so well because we oftentimes promised more than we were able to deliver. And now I think we are at the stage where both the focus on what are the outcomes, how do we actually use technology to improve the quality of life of citizens, that shift is starting to show off. We are seeing new players come into the game. It's no longer just hardware companies, it's software companies, whether it's Sidewalk Labs from Alphabet, Google's parent company, AT&T, the telecoms players taking very big bets on the space, as well as engineering companies and construction companies. So I think we are at the brink of a new age of smart cities, and I think this is the time for us all collectively to really deliver on the promise of what technology can do to improve the quality of life of the citizens in a broad range of dimensions, not just in efficiency.
Okay, so just to throw a spanner in the work here, we've just seen Daniel's amazing transportation sort of solution, a mobility solution. I guess the question for you, Daniel, we have two people who are very heavily invested in making cities smarter now, but your innovation could really sort of change the game in the sense of, do we need cities in the way that we have done for the past few hundred years? Is geography going to become less important when we have VR and we can do meetings and we have Lilium taxis sort of ferrying us around? Does that change things significantly, do you think, in terms of the way that we've been looking at them for the last 10, 20 years?
Absolutely. I think almost everything will change in terms of how cities look and how we are planning them. The big question is, are the existing cities like Munich, which have a very long tradition and an existing geography, how are they changing and how are the new cities being designed? That's probably two aspects of the whole story. But what we will definitely see, for example, is that cities will be less a city in the size it is right now. If we have a service like the Lilium service, we can make a state like Bavaria more or less one metropolitan area. So it doesn't matter that much where you are living, whether you're living in Munich or in the next big city away, because you can still work in Munich and still be there. And that's just one aspect, I think. There's going to be many other, like once we have self-driving cars, we're going to see a huge change on public transportation systems. We would even probably question, do we still need them? Do we still need them in the way they are right now? I guess no, because a self-driving car service is essentially somewhat close to a bus, but much better because it's on demand and it brings you directly next to the door where you want to be. We're probably going to see much greener cities. I guess we'll have urban aviation and we're going to have a lot of transportation. The transit traffic shifted around the city, so we will fly around cities instead of going through cities, and that will relieve a lot of traffic and congestion in the city. We can do some of the traffic inside the city with urban mobility, and I guess we'll also see more tunneling in cities, and all these factors will play into a direction that we'll see much greener cities with a lot better life quality and less noise than what we have today, less pollution.
Sure. Francesca, you talked about some of the pressures in Barcelona. Europe's maybe one of Europe's top 3 tourist destinations, maybe. Obviously, Airbnb has had a significant impact on the city, people being forced out to the edges. Is what sort of Daniel's suggesting in terms of that kind of making geography less kind of important on the city? Does that seem like a solution to you in terms of the way that Barcelona will evolve in the coming years?
Well, first of all, I think all these new solutions need to be integrated with the solutions that the city run at the moment and try to make all these smart testbed and experiments sustainable in time for cities. So, for instance, we see this kind of 5G and driverless car need to be integrated with investment in public transportation. That's what we are doing. So we're integrating tram, buses, bicycle lanes, and we're going to a multimodal transportation system that's more efficient, more sustainable, and we're investing public money to do that. And then we are creating a mobility lab also together with SEAT and universities locally. I think the innovation ecosystem is very important to experiment new solutions, but to make them really sustainable and also for the cities economically viable. So really to go to a circular, more sustainable economy. And on that, I link it up to what you're asking me. Sometimes city really struggles in order to understand what should we do with predatory data-driven platforms. And cities are the ones that are coming together. So we're working with Berlin, with New York, with Amsterdam. We're coming together to understand how can we better regulate Airbnb or Uber, and not only regulate them, but how can we build alternatives that bring good benefit to the city. And the thing is, for me, it's about creating ethical digital standards for this digital revolution and give it a direction. So we really want to have, more cleaner, greener cities and to have new economic models that move away from data extractivism or surveillance capitalism to a more sustainable model, where then we have to work with the local ecosystem and making sure, for instance, we ask Airbnb, can we get access to the data or the metadata? Can we apply algorithmic transparency to the business model so that we are not regulating a black box? I mean, if
Okay.
we don't know what goes in and goes out, we don't know how a business model of Airbnb can affect the house prices in Barcelona. And I mean, cities like Barcelona and Berlin, they have a lot of issues with tourism. So we have to make sure that housing is affordable for residents, and then we can stimulate innovation that is more fair for the local environment. So I think, I mean, for us, digital ethical standards is really important. I mean, in Barcelona, we are doing a digital transformation where we are mandating the use of free software and open source software, open standards, and building open platforms. We are radically changing procurement, this unsexy word when government spends citizen money to invest in innovation, and we're making it transparent, and we're asking SMEs and local companies and local talent to come on board and use public money to innovate. So we're creating digital marketplaces and collaborating with cities across the world to get innovation meaningful for the city. And then we are creating data sovereignty standards, which means even when we do big contracts, how can we make sure that the data stay with the public? So the data belongs to the citizens, and we make sure that we can create data as a city infrastructure, which is public, on top of which innovators, startups, and the local economy can build these fully digital future services that we need. But for that, we have to, get to what we call data sovereignty or digital sovereignty. And I think we can start from cities.
Okay, so Jana, we heard very much the kind of like the perspective there from Francesca from kind of City Hall, as it were. You're working with organizations. Like, how can they best sort of better think like entrepreneurs, or how can they better think in terms of the kind of like the civic kind of mindset that Francesca is describing?
Great question. But if I may quickly jump into your earlier question to Daniel and Francesca about the transformation. It is really, change is always hard, and it is hard particularly for the incumbents. But what is really exciting about the smart cities space is that we have over 3,000 cities in this world that have over 150 or 200,000 inhabitants. This is a lab of experimentation right now, and it's happening across the globe in all income level cities, and I think we'll see change happen. So if you expect that it will just, if you close your eyes, it will go away, it will not go away. It will change many business models for many companies that are in many of these spaces already. So you better watch out. I think it's exciting because there is so many cities experimenting in their own way. That, on the other hand, on the flip side, to come into your question, what does that mean for organizations and companies who are collaborating in this effort? I think for many companies, and I truly hope we will collectively be very successful to deliver on the value and deliver on the promise of citizen impact. Yet to get there, we do need to shift our mindset a little bit towards, let's focus on the real problems of cities, not just selling your products. Let's think about what is it, the whole project of a smart city initiative that it takes for the cities to deliver the value, and be a partner to the city across that whole value chain, not just getting your product shipped over to the customer. This is not a one-person game. This is really a teamwork. Collaborate with everyone who actually needs to contribute in order for us to get the value delivered to the city. And last, put your head a little bit on the side of the city. Think like a mayor. They are the most exposed, probably, decision makers in the world, because every citizen is watching what they are doing, and not everyone agrees. So they will be criticized from many sides for any change, because there is always costs to change. So try to help the cities and their mayors to address and think beforehand and anticipate some of those questions that they will get. And I think collectively, if we make that mindset and really work together to try to deliver the value in whatever area you're working on, whether it's transportation, whether it's citizen participation, I think we are at the brink of hopefully showing some real value outcomes. Okay,
so Daniel, we've had quite a kind of complex sort of like scenario painted. I mean, cities are obviously hugely complex environments, as Francesca and Jana have described. From the perspective of an entrepreneur who's really innovating in, I think, extraordinary ways, what are the main challenges you face in terms of deploying the technology? Like, if you wanted to get it into, I don't know, maybe Barcelona or Munich or wherever, next year, what would be your ideal sort of set of circumstances? What would you need?
Yeah, yeah. I think that's one of the best questions. If we want to change, we need to have regulation in which we can change. And what we see right now with Lilium is that we can certify the airplane according to existing legislation, and we can operate the airplane according to existing legislation on existing airports and helicopters. But if we take a closer look on that, it doesn't work at all. So a helicopter pad today, certifying this takes roughly 2 years, and the level of standardization is super low. So if I would approach Barcelona and say, hey, let's build 50 landing pads together somewhere in your city, you're going to tell me I have no idea how, according to which standards, and so on. And this is, I guess, one of the, it's not only a problem that we have with Lilium, we have it in almost any technological, at least, innovation which we will apply. And for this, what we would need is a dialogue that we will bring up very quickly on how do we standardize those landing pads, how do we standardize noise regulation, how do we make sure that cities can keep with the pace of probably private entities who want to build landing pads, for example, in this case, and make sure that there's enough personnel inside the cities to let's say manage the certification of those landing pads and so on. So we ultimately reach a state that we have in the automotive industry right now, that there is very clear rules that apply European, in some case worldwide, and everyone knows this is what we can do. But on the other hand, we have to make sure that the regulation we set up is still flexible for the next innovation. So we've done that mistake very often in the past, that we have set regulation that was fine for the moment, but for the next step it didn't work. So we should also keep in mind how we set up the legislating systems and the governments and Brussels and everyone else to make sure that we can easily adapt. But the best is if the legislation in first place is flexible and adaptable to new standards.
Okay, so Francesca, maybe I could come back to you at this point, because I'm interested to know how in Barcelona you're working with entrepreneurs like Daniel. How are you encouraging that kind of growth of the ecosystem? What's the best way for cities to start really encouraging the kind of innovation we're seeing here?
Yeah. I think the important thing is to leave some space for experimental government. And I think in this space, cities are really the right spaces for experimentalism, and making sure that you have this ecosystem that come together for these big urban and social challenges. And then you have to build actually standards that grow organically from the bottom up. For instance, our experience with our sensor network that we have in Barcelona is called Sentillo, and is an open standards, and now is applied all over the world, like Dubai is running it, Amsterdam, other cities, because it's open and people can just pick it up and build on top of it. And this was born bottom up with use cases and making work. And we are now really operating in this way. For instance, we have a pilot in Barcelona on basic income with cryptocurrencies. So we're experimenting on that, which I think is a crucial thing, because in the future of work, we have to start thinking about implementing things like basic income, gender equality in the technology sector. And we're doing this kind of pilots with cryptocurrencies to see how it works. And that's for us experimentalism. And then we measure the policy, so it's evidence-based, we gather data, we learn from it, and then we can apply it at city scale. So I think it's this kind of mindset that we need, and cities can do it. And cities are doing more and more of this kind of experiments. And lastly, I would advocate for the collective intelligence of citizens to be integrated into policy making. I mean, this is not trivial. For us, it's very at the DNA of what we do, is really how can we integrate collective intelligence of citizens into the way we take decisions, we make policy. For instance, like we have a digital platform. It is not the only way. Digital always complement real life participation. It's called Decidi in Barcelona. 70% of the government agenda of Barcelona was created together with citizens. So it's about changing the relationship between governments and citizens and making sure that they're part and at the center of what governments do. It's really about rethinking the public in this perspective. So for us, this is also about how we build this ecosystem, but citizens should be part of this, because otherwise we cannot have better, more livable, sustainable cities.
Okay, well, we've very much been talking about kind of like a European kind of perspective. Jana, I know that you kind of work, globally. What are you learning from the growth of cities outside of Europe? Clearly, that's where the real expansion is happening, particularly China, Asia, Africa. The cities are growing at a pace that they haven't grown in Europe for many years. What can we learn from the way that they're implementing change in practice, best practices?
I think there's a lot of really exciting stuff happening. I think, Daniel, you made the point about the brownfield cities, of bringing smart technology into existing cities versus the greenfield cities. And when you have a country like China that already has over 600 cities of more than 200,000 inhabitants, which is 3 times as many as all of Europe, and when over 200 of them already have smart city initiatives, that's an experiment on its own, because they have, in many of these cities, they are still growing so fast, they are building new districts and experimenting. So that is an exciting space to watch, and I think they are doing it oftentimes with the different mindset that we would have. Similarly, in Africa, for example, where the wireless technology and even now increasingly broadband technology in the cities is spreading, it is exciting to see how you find ways to really translate technology into impact by using applications, using the tools you have. So I think there's a lot to learn. And I think the one thing, particularly for technology companies to remember, is that when you think of what do the citizens really want? They want more time and less time wasted on commute. They want better health. They want a safe environment. Any of these outcomes that you look at explicitly, and when you then think about not only of how to sell your product, but what is the overall toolkit of smart cities that we all collectively have. And if, let's say, a city wants to improve health, what tools can we use collectively, and how can we translate that into impact? It's very different in Africa, where most of the health challenges are really preventable, infectious diseases, than it is in a developed city where it's mostly about chronic diseases of heart conditions or diabetes. So I think making sure that we think of the full toolkit to solve the problems, and actually that is the way in which you can get the kind of impact. So for example, take another example, transit. If you really go after reducing the commute time, which in big cities like New York and Rio takes about 90 minutes per person every day, you can reduce that by 10 to 15 minutes per person every day by using everything you can, from basically reducing congestion, from intelligent traffic lights and real-time load balancing between roads, reducing some of the running bottlenecks that are the commercial vehicles that often go slower and are not fully loaded, then reducing time looking for parking with smart parking applications, as well as in-time, real-time transit information, etc. And those things actually add up and make a big difference for the quality of life. So Moscow, for example, is doing exactly that approach, adding on investments on public transit, and they are talking about adding days or even a week or weeks back to free time to their citizens doing that. So I think knowing exactly what are the challenges, what are the starting conditions of the different city, and finding the full set of toolkits to that, I think is the key. Okay. Across any part of the world.
So Jana's clearly talking about kind of like there's all kinds of ways we can use data in order to sort of make the city more effective, but presumably we're going to also, especially in cities that have been around for hundreds of years, we're going to have to really think seriously about our infrastructure. Dan, you must have been thinking about this. Like, what's the infrastructure of cities going to look like in the future? It's going to, I imagine, be very different from today.
Yes, of course it must be. The question is, if we speak about infrastructure, is it only about transportation, or should we not also count all the rest, like kindergartens and so on? The city basically covers everything that we do in our life, so from health services to schools and so on. Your question was probably more directed towards the infrastructure for transportation. I think here, of course, we're going to see that big change towards air mobility, and that's probably going to make a big change, not so much in terms of the new infrastructure for the airplanes. These landing spots are very small, but it's going to change the existing infrastructure on the ground in a sense that, first of all, we're going to see less congestion on the ground, and then secondly, we can probably eliminate, let's say, 50% of the streets because we have other means of transportation that either go in the air or underground, and therefore improve the life quality, but also the density, maybe the possible density of our cities. But the most important aspect here, I think, is that, as you mentioned, data, that we make sure that cities can learn from each other. So what you said is exactly right. I think we need those trial cases in which we can try out how do real people react on those new systems. It doesn't help if we all plan great stuff on our computers and it looks nice in the numbers and no one really was living with it. We really need those cities doing trial cases with us. And then we need platforms in which cities can exchange the data they have and the experience they have and make sure they have standards which do not only apply in one city, but which apply ideally in whole Europe. And I think that's the biggest challenge. We have cities which are increasingly set up very well on the tech side. We see very competent people approaching us, and they are, aviation is not something a city thinks about every day, but they send us people who are very smart in these things. So that's also already something that has changed, I think, over the last maybe 10 years, that cities are thinking into this tech dimension. But what's still probably missing a lot is this exchange platforms of how can we make sure that not every city is going their own path, but we actually have models which we found out they are great for people. Then let's share them, then let's spread them and make sure it works elsewhere as well.
Do you want to comment on that, Francesca?
Sure. I mean, first of all, we recently set up the Global City CIOs Council, which is bringing together CIOs from all around the world, and actually also a European chapter. And that's really the platform we are using for seeing, okay, what cities are doing, what kind of standards we can exchange, what are the open digital services that we can share, how you're doing the digital transformation, and learning from each other, but building on the software and experiments of other cities. And it's really working very well, and we're applying also to regulation. For me, like a big exciting thing about this future data landscape is about how we decentralize the infrastructure of data and how we socialize data, we democratize data. Of course, bringing, using the leverage of the GDPR and the advantage of Europe about data protection as a human right and encryption as a human right. And then we create data as a city infrastructure, on top of which all these entrepreneurs, citizens themselves, social cooperatives, entrepreneurial talent can build digital services. We run a project, it's called Decode, Decentralized Citizen-Owned Data Ecosystem. Actually, it's a flagship funded by the European Commission. Amsterdam and Barcelona are working together with some of the best cryptographers in Europe, and we're building blockchain-based distributed ledger architectures on top of which we are solving the problem of scalability and privacy. And we're saying, let's give back data ownership to people. People own the data. They should decide what kind of data they want to share, on what terms, with whom. We should bring algorithmic transparency and create this infrastructure so that Europe can become again a digital leader. And I think we can do it bottom up, starting from cities that can become almost custodians of these new digital rights. And for me, this scenario is really exciting. And in Barcelona, we're working on that. We're also appointing a new chief data officer and try to make it part of the way we really take decisions in the city. And I think, in Europe, we do have great cryptographers, people working on distributed ledgers and blockchains, and we have the building blocks to build this kind of infrastructure, starting from cities, but for all Europe and European citizens.
So, Jana, we're kind of running out of time, but maybe we could just touch on one kind of final point. Like, clearly there's no one-size-fits-all kind of policy. Like, how do, Barcelona will be very different from Munich, which will be very different from Lagos, which will be very different from Moscow. Like, how do decision makers like Francesca, how best to sort of like look at that kind of palette of skills and leverage that they can bring?
Yeah, I think it's less of a problem for people like Francesca, who clearly know their city very well. I mean, people typically know their own city. It is a more challenge on the other side if you are a company working with cities and trying to understand and trying to see how you can collaborate and help them. And I think there are so many different ways in which cities vary. First of all, their priorities are very different. If you think of Copenhagen, for example, that has been very clear on their focus on sustainability, on the zero emission target for 2025, that's a very different target than what Singapore has, for example, which is much broader, smart nation strategy, longer term. And then you have each US city has a slightly different emphasis, whether it's San Francisco's more let all flowers bloom to close collaboration in Toronto, for example, for district development with one company. So I think that's one thing. But even if the cities have a the same target. I already mentioned the case of health. It can depend really on the initial starting point, on what are the right tools to pull out of the toolkit. And then, of course, the third factor also is that you have very different ways in which cities are comfortable working with the private sector. There are some cities that really are very glad to partner and collaborate very, very closely. Others, for many reasons, might choose to have much more hands-off solutions. So all of that, when you take that for a company working with cities and very focused on delivering the citizen value, it really is important to have your hammer that you know will be very good at hammering the nail in, but it is flexible enough so that it can actually work for different kinds of nails and different kinds of solutions, and that can work with different tools that those cities will want to bring in. So I think the flexibility will be key because of the fact that we have so many cities.
Okay, one final question. All three of you, jump in, whoever wants to jump in. Which technology or innovation do you think is going to have the most significant impact on cities in the next 5 to 10 years? Like, what really is going to have fundamental and significant effect on the way that we live our lives? Anyone want to hazard a guess? We've heard.
I think I said it already. I think, cities cannot think too much long term. I mean, we cannot do this kind of moonshot challenges because we have real problems to solve with citizens right now. So, for instance, for us, the question, of course, of data. I mean, this is clear. And I mean, all this conference is about, so who will own the data and the artificial intelligence that you can build on top of that data will have a lot of power, right? And so citizens, I mean, with AI-driven services, I mean, it is already part of what we do. Like we have platforms, we have AI-driven services everywhere, and now we're trying to see, what is happening. How can we make sure there is, for instance, New York City has a law on algorithmic transparency, and now they are applying to all the time that the city does an AI services should be able to be inspected. It should be transparent. You should have access to the data and the metadata so that you're sure what is inside and how you can regulate that. And I think, this is a big challenge for us. And the question of how can we also incentivize the creation of, artificial intelligence centers. Like Barcelona has the Supercomputing Institute. We have a lot of data talent and we have a lot of capacity locally. And now the city is trying to use this knowledge and talent and apply it to real problems like, air quality, CO2 emission, the future of transportation, participatory democracy. And this is key because, all the data scientists are there doing large-scale simulation, deep learning on everything, but they want to solve real problems. So they're asking us, what do we need in the city? How can you connect us with citizens and with real social problems? And that is where the city is really leading in giving the direction to this capacity. So I think really it's about bringing all the talent and the expertise together and give a mission to innovation and making sure that we can actually start together with all this collective intelligence to get there and set the stage for this possibility.
Okay, anyone else want to jump in with a...
I want to very quickly to say, I think it's actually autonomous transport, whether on ground or on the air. And the reason I'm an economist, and most scarce resource in the world today is land in the city centers. And all the parking, if we can get into autonomous vehicles, they don't need to be autonomous vehicles and planes, they don't need to be parked in the city. And that for me is really exciting. That is a way to transform cities in many ways.
Daniel.
She took away our...
Sorry.
She took away my point, but that brings me to another one, and I think that's maybe the most important technology that we're speaking about, but it's not really a technology. It's the change of our own behavior that will make the biggest difference. We can speak about AI and planes and autonomy and all that stuff, but what really matters is the change of our behavior, of people, how politics react and so on. And here I think one of the super important things that, especially in Europe, we have to change is that we apply our intellectual capability to really doing things, to not only producing papers in the labs and spending 90% of our smart people on producing papers in a scientific system. No, let's put them really on solving the problems we have. And they come up with tons of smart ideas, but then we have to make sure they become economically viable, and we put the smallest amount of obstacles in the way of these ideas to at least try them out. We'll find out then that some stuff is not going to work or things are different than we thought when we were figuring them out in the lab. But that's, I think, something that we need to get much better in to really, let's say, benefit from all the opportunities of all these technologies that come up. And we also have to do this because we want to make sure that we do it in the right way, that everyone benefits in the right way. So we not only, let's say, have on the one side papers written and on the other side we suddenly start executing things. We really need to go that path from shifting our intellectual capability to doing things and then to choosing the right things for the wider group of people.
Okay, as ever, it's about technology, but it's also about human ingenuity.
Yeah.
Thank you, all three of the great panel. Thank you.